Welcome everyone to Scientist to Go. My name is Zoe. I'm an educator here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over how the program is laid out. So first, we'll hear from our speaker, Claire Enterline, about the research that she does for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have 20 or so minutes to ask questions. So if you think of anything, feel free to throw it into the chat and I'll read them out to Claire at the end. Today, our guest, like I said, is Claire Enterline. She's a program manager here at GMRI. And we're going to hear a little bit about some of the ecosystems that are being impacted by climate change in the Gulf of Maine, as well as how we can build partnerships to build resilience worldwide. So I will turn it over to you, Claire.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to put up my presentation. Does that look good, Zoe?
Looks great.
Great. All right, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Claire Enterline, and broadly, I study the impacts of climate change on nearshore habitat and marine species. So, tell you a little bit more about what I do. Um, and some of the things that I'll talk about are like, how did I get here? What type of research and work do I do at GMRI? Why is understanding and mapping habitat important? And some of the tools that we use to study marine habitat and species. And then really looking forward to any questions and comments that you all have. So broadly, some of the things that I have looked at over time are salt marshes and eelgrass beds, lobster, and one of my favorite species ever, rainbow smelt, who are spawning right now in a stream near you. So, what is a marine ecologist? That's generally a term that kind of describes something that I do. And it was interesting kind of doing a little bit of looking into this myself. When I looked up some stuff to answer this question for you all, I put some stuff together and I thought this pretty well described kind of what a marine ecologist does. So, as a scientist who studies the interaction between marine organisms and their environment, including both physical and biological factors. And what does that mean, either from day to day or how kind of this all adds up? So certainly doing field research has been a big component of my work at different points in time. And sometimes it's not a big component. Um, and there's also a lot of technical work. So using advances in technology and then also a lot of advances in like statistical modeling and a lot of computer work. Doing a lot of data analysis, so understanding the interaction between the different data that either we collect or is collected by others to understand community structures, like how different species interact with each other, and also their environment. And then a big part of something that has been something that I do, not necessarily for all marine ecologists, but with my background, I'm working for state government for a long time, really looking to collect information and do data analysis that can help inform management, conservation, and sustainable fisheries and ecosystem management. So, how did I get into marine ecology? I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, but my parents are from Kansas. So I always kind of think of like Dorothy on the yellow brick road, trying to find a different place to go. And that certainly has been kind of a theme of my career path is following the yellow brick road. So I went to Boston University for my undergrad, where I got to do things like explore a really awesome city. Be in lectures a lot of the time, but also have a lot of both lab experience and also a great part of the BU program at the time was also some great field experience within some of the biology classes, like going out into the woods and taking field measurements. And that I really liked all that because it showed me that I liked all of that stuff together. I also at Boston University was able to take advantage of study of fraud programs, which were really great. And I did two. I went to New Zealand and did a geological field study. I also went to Ecuador and visited the Yasuni National Park and the Galapagos Islands. And these were really great experiences to both see a huge range of ecosystems, to work with the local Waorani tribe in that portion of the Amazon rainforest, and to work with my wonderful mentor and advisor, Kelly Swing, shown at the bottom, to look at the impacts of an oil field, which you can see one of the methane gas um, and pipes up in the upper left, and look at the impact on species as part of a 10-year study. And so that really got me to think about how much I liked both being in the field and seeing change over time. I then went back to Boston and graduated and got a job with the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. So every single state or every single coastal state has the opportunity to participate in the Coastal Zone Management Program, in which they get both federal funds that are matched by state funds to look at things that are impacting both coastal communities, like here, storms, and things like how we stabilize or manage our shorelines, to things like non-point source pollution and other kinds of things that impact like water quality and stuff like that. And so this really got me thinking about what is state government's role in coastal communities, things like sea level rise, storms, and the impacts of development. And then also looking at things like how can risk be mitigated through planning, infrastructure changes, and community awareness. So from coastal zone management, I came up to Maine, and I wanted to get back into fish. And so I worked for the Maine Department of Marine Resources as a diadromous species manager and researcher. And through DMR, I was able to get my master's degree in marine fisheries through tagging fish and looking at where they go, specifically smelt and river herring. And had a lot of work with communities that was really, really great. And also understanding the challenges of all of the things that come with reduced numbers of fish and communities trying to help, which in a lot of cases meant community members out there in the water passing fish back and forth, and helping to make these fish runs survive. And so specifically diadromous means fish that go back and forth between freshwater and saltwater. So in this case, both rainbow smelt and river herring. You can see them being fished here up at the top in the ocean, and then handed back and forth over a freshwater stream. So they spawn, they lay their eggs and their milk in freshwater systems, and then they go out to the ocean to live their adult lives. And so that kind of life history adds a lot of complexity and a lot of chances to take a look at what they're doing. So from DMR, I started working for the Maine Coastal Zone Management Program, or the Maine Coastal Program, and started pulling more of this stuff together, not just looking at fish, not just looking at communities separately, but starting to pull some of this stuff together, mainly through habitat. And so I started doing a lot of habitat modeling of eelgrass, salt marsh, and also the seafloor, or what we call the benthic environment. And also looking at things like invasive species discovery and things that can help protect some of these vulnerable habitats, like especially salt marshes and eelgrasses, through community resilient habitat and community infrastructure. So the thing that was really fun in this position was a lot of field work out on this boat, the Amy Gale, which is a fishing vessel that we used as a research vessel. This big instrument up here, we nicknamed the Big Underwater Backbreaking Apparatus, or BUBBA. And it is fit with a water quality sonde that measures things like temperature and salinity, and then also a big claw grabber. And so we would grab the sediment from the bottom and see if it's like sand or gravel or mud, or if it didn't get anything, then it was rock. And we would sort out all the little creatures that lived in those. So you can see us doing that up here. From that, we were able to understand what was happening on the seafloor. We also, this boat was fit with a multi-beam echo sounder or MBES, and that sends acoustic signals, so sound down into the water. And then, depending on how strong the sound signal is returned back to the boat, we get information about how hard the seafloor is and the depth of the seafloor. And so it takes something like this map over here, which before was not mapped very well. So it kind of looks like a blob. In fact, I called this area of the ocean the blob because we did not know what the seafloor looked like there. But after we went over with the multi-beam echo sounder and got more detailed information, we found that it really looks like this, which is super interesting. So this area that we thought was just kind of maybe muddy, we didn't really know. We found out that there's this big glacial moraine out there. This is pretty far offshore, that there are some of these submerged valleys out there. So it gave a lot of information about that we could piece together more about the geological history of the Gulf of Maine, and also how species might interact with the seafloor in this area. The other thing that we can do with this kind of information, so taking pictures of the seafloor, taking sediment grabs, and taking the information from the multi-beam echo sander about depth and hardness, we can start to create things like these, which may just look like maps, but they're maps that are informed by those kinds of sampling. And so we can get sediment maps. So this one over on the left here, blue is mud, the black is rock, and this is a big sandy area. It's called the Kennebec Paleo Delta because when the glaciers were a lot lower, or when the glaciers were here and the water levels were a lot lower, there was a really big sand delta that came out of the Kennebec and was exposed. We can also use this kind of information for things like understanding offshore wind sighting or other things that can be done out in the marine environment. And this is in the Kennebec River. We can also understand where these things like sediment ripples are, which are really important for how species use the seafloor. Specifically, these sand ripples here are where sturgeon overwinter. Sturgeon are a really big fish that have been around for a really long time. And in the winter, they come into the river and go in between these sand ripples and just kind of stay there very slowly in kind of a hibernation state with their tails just kind of flicking every once in a while. It's really neat to see. So I've been with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute for a little over 3 years now, and I've really appreciated working here as I can bring all of these things together, and I can also ask questions about the interaction between fisheries and habitat and climate change and communities. And so here's just some figures that go up around here, and I'll go into each one of these. And I'm also very lucky at GMRI to currently be getting my PhD with the University of Maine doing some of this research. So this is where I really am focusing all of my work on the impact of climate change. So climate change is where in the ocean, what we're seeing is we're seeing warming temperatures, we're seeing sea level rise, we're seeing changes in chemistry like ocean acidification. And also, it's not necessarily a linear trend. So sometimes, like the past couple of years, because the ocean currents have been changed because of bigger processes that are happening in the oceans, we'll get cold spells and warm spells. And so instead of this linear change all the time, we are seeing that, but we're also seeing an increase in variability between years, which can be hard to deal with as a species. So one of the big things that I focus on is looking at the impacts of climate change and how that's impacting the oceans, and in turn, the impact then on nearshore habitat, specifically salt marshes and eelgrass. And I do this together with a lot of partners. I think this is a really big component of any of the work that we do is always, understanding what you bring to the table and what other people can bring to the table. And so, working with state partners, other researchers, other universities, to make sure that we are collecting data, looking at a whole system, and then making sure that that data can then be used to inform resource management. So, a little bit about salt marshes and eelgrass beds. Um, we know that they have a lot of different functions, including being habitat for species, being really important for reducing the impacts of storms, but they also are natural carbon sinks or a natural climate solution. So, through the process of photosynthesis, marsh and eelgrass beds take in CO2 and they take it in as and then they convert it to organic carbon. And then as those plants die, especially in salt marshes, they die in place and they stay there and they get buried. And this is a particularly effective process in healthy coastal ecosystems, and one that can be not as productive when these ecosystems are undergoing stress. So, the different kinds of blue carbon ecosystems that we have in Maine, salt marshes and eelgrass beds both have burial of that carbon at the site and the soils that are there, both from the vegetation that's there and also because they catch sediment as it's coming in with the tide and they bury that sediment in the roots. And then there's also macroalgae, so seaweeds, both naturally and farmed seaweeds. Some of that carbon from seaweed does get buried in that place, but also part of it gets exchanged and a lot of it goes out to the ocean and gets buried in other places in the ocean. So in salt marshes in Maine, we have taken, at Bates College, students have taken cores all across the state. And these cores, you can see a picture of it over here. It's like a big cylinder, and you put it in the ground and you stomp it down. And when it comes out, it has soil inside of it. And so you can see the soil coming out in this picture over here. And it comes out and we keep it in that same line, and then you take sections of it. And from those sections, then you can do some lab analysis to understand the amount of carbon that's within different sections of each of those cores. And through that, my role then is to do a lot of data analysis. And so here's just a couple of figures, what comes out of it. So some of the things that we look at are like how carbon varies within one of those cores, and that gives us a picture back in time to understand and deepen those cores, which was like either hundreds to sometimes thousands of years ago, how much carbon was being accumulated at that time. And then also recently, how much carbon is being accumulated. And this varies based on things like how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how healthy the salt marsh is, and other environmental factors. So I also look at how does carbon differ based on features of a salt marsh, like how close it is to the main river channel, or what is the tide there. So broadly, what we find is that the further away that you get from the main river channel in a marsh, the more carbon that there is. Also, the bigger the tides are. So like in down East Maine, we might get 11 to 12-foot tides on average. Whereas down in like Massachusetts or New Hampshire, you get your tides are less big. So it might just be like 5 feet in some cases. So as the tides are bigger, the difference between low tide and high tide is bigger, the more carbon is generally sequestered in a marsh. And so we also look at things like change over time. And so this is a map of eelgrass beds. So eelgrass also sequester carbon. And the in this map, the darker green is where, or any of the green is where eelgrass was in like 1997, 2010, or more recently in 2018. But when these eelgrass beds were mapped in 2022 in pink, you can see like, wow, there was a really big decline. So that's one of the things that I've been really concerned about. These maps were made based on airplanes flying low over the coast and taking photographs, really high resolution photographs. And then people looking at those photographs and marking out, circling where they're seeing eelgrass because they can see it through the water. That's one way that we do it. It's really accurate, but it's also really, really time intensive. So right now we have a project with the Rue Institute at Northeastern University in the Maine Department of Environmental Protection to see if we can use satellite imagery and machine learning methods to map eelgrass every single year. Because so this is another thing is that in many places we only have a picture of what eelgrass looks like in certain years. We don't know what's happening every year. If we know what happens every year, then maybe we'll be able to understand how some of the environmental changes, like temperature or how much rainfall there is, um, are impacting the amount of eelgrass that we have in that year. So that's one of the new things that we're trying to figure out. So that's habitat. And then I also look at how then species are using habitat differently based on climate change. So I'm getting my PhD right now looking at how lobster are using habitat differently. So based on some of the bigger surveys that we do, so some of the surveys that happen to look at how fish are, how many fish there are in the ocean, what kinds of fish there are in the ocean are called trawl surveys. And these are run by some of the big research organizations, or mainly by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And they go offshore, and we also have state trawl surveys. And they have a big net that they tow behind the boat on the seafloor. And this happens every year, and they go up and down the coast, and it gives us a sense of how species are moving around each year. And what we have found is that species, for example, black sea bass or hake or mackerel or river herring, are starting to use deeper depths as well as moving north. These may be the same fish, these may be different fish, but over time, we're finding that after 2010, that the center of distribution is what we call it. So where there are the most of these kinds of fish has shifted to be both in deeper waters and north. And that is directly tied to the temperature in those areas. Um, that is also occurring for lobster. So digging more into lobster, how does climate change impact lobster? It affects them in so many different ways, including through shell disease, through lobsters have a hard shell. So in order to grow, they molt, they shed that shell. And so they can grow. So they're molting more often because they're growing faster because it's warmer. Fecundity is how many babies they have, and how many basically how many eggs they produce. And so when the temperatures are higher, they're producing fewer eggs in some areas where it's way too hot for them, like in southern New England now. But in some other areas, like in the eastern Gulf of Maine, down East Maine, they're starting to have higher fecundity because the temperature is now within a range that makes it so that it is easier for them to reproduce. Um, and it also impacts things like their behavior and their habitat use. So we always think of lobsters as in rocky habitats because it provides them a place to hide, provides them usually a lot of food. But as the temperature warms up, they might be moving out into sandier or muddier areas because those are the areas that are deeper. And so if they're trying to find cooler temperatures, they might be now more exposed. Well, when they're more exposed and when the temperature is warmer, we might have species coming into the area like black sea bass who also like to hang out around rocks, but might see a lobster now on open sand and eat them. And so the impact of temperature might be not only affecting how lobster are using habitat, but how other species are taking advantage of them. So this is a map of the seafloor in Maine. Red is rock, blue is mud, and green is gravel. So that's what the substrate looks like on the seafloor. And if you look, you can see that where rock and gravel are, which are places where lobster are more able to hide, those are also in areas that are shallower. So if lobster are moving deeper, in order to find cooler temperatures, they are going to be moving into more open habitat. So this is one of the things that I'm looking at using some of those surveys that we have, like trawl surveys and also trap surveys, and different data that has already been collected throughout the coast from southern New England and the Gulf of Maine. So we can understand how this kind of behavior might be related to temperature, might be related to the kind of habitat that's available, and also might be related to overall abundance, how many lobsters there are, and how much they're being fished. So here's a picture of some of those surveys. And this impacts not only our understanding of how lobster are behaving with climate change, but because we use those surveys that I mentioned to estimate what the population is, this has impacts to the catchability of those surveys and how we understand population dynamics in our assessment of the population. So in order to understand these relationships, we need to have a good idea of what the seafloor looks like. Over on the left is a really big map of the Gulf of Maine and a little bit of southern New England. And the green are areas that have that high resolution multi-beam eco sounder data that I talked about before. And you got to see the difference between that, what that looks like. And some of the older collected data, like here's some folks on a boat back, and this is probably the 1940s. But back to 1851, they were collecting lead line surveys, which is you take a rope, it has lead on the bottom, it sinks to the bottom, and you measure how much rope goes out to get the depth. They cannot do that in every single place. And so they are understanding of a lot of the seafloor, especially in areas in down East Maine and offshore in the Gulf of Maine. It's pretty old data. And so this impacts how we understand both what's on the seafloor and how we're able to answer some of those questions like I was talking about with lobster. So for example, here over on the left where the lobster is currently sitting is a map of the seafloor in a place off of Casco Bay. And this is older quality data. And then over on the right here is some of is that same area mapped with multi-beam eco sounder. And I've circled the places where you can see that with the new data, we know that those areas are in fact a lot deeper. And so in this instance, this really helps us understand that lobster may be moving into some of those deeper areas, and we wouldn't be able to make the same inference or understanding if we didn't have these higher quality data. So one of the questions that we ask is not just how lobster are using habitat differently, but how does the quality of the seafloor data that we have impact our ability to answer that question? And so finally, the other thing that I do is kind of working with a lot of partners to put all that kind of information together. So those kinds of projects I look at a local and a regional scale in the Gulf of Maine and southern New England. But climate change is happening everywhere, and fisheries across the world are dealing with these kinds of issues. And there's a lot of people doing the same kind of studies that I've been doing in different places in the world. And so We work through the UN Ocean Decade or Decade of Ocean Science and Sustainable Development, which is from 2021 to 2030. We have a program called Fish Score, which stands for Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans, um, and for changing oceans and resilient ecosystems. And through this program, we talk with people all over the world about how climate change is impacting marine fisheries through things like physical conditions, like how currents are, how warm things are, to the impacts then on fish stocks and ecosystems. Also, things like how is climate change impacting working waterfronts, and communities. If communities are not able to collect the types of fish that they did before or the amounts of fish that they did before, that's going to have a big impact on the community. So, broadly, what is the Ocean Decade? The Ocean Decade has a pretty big vision, which is the science we need for the ocean that we want. And this includes things like fisheries, but also there are programs devoted to a clean ocean, so water quality, a predicted ocean, so understanding all of those changes, an inspiring and an engaging ocean. So how do people interact with the ocean? How do they have community around the ocean? A safe ocean. So those are devoted to things like understanding if there are more like hurricanes or typhoons, or how sea level rise is affecting communities. There are programs devoted to that kind of thing. So Fish Score, even though we're focusing on the impact of climate change to fisheries, the Ocean Decade is much more broad and is looking overall at how we can sustainably interact with the ocean over time. So, Fish Score, through our program, how do we work within the Ocean Decade and how do we work to advance both our understanding of climate on fisheries as well as to make fisheries more resilient and sustainable over time with climate change? So Fish Corps is co-led by the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and the Environmental Defense Fund with the goal to sustain fisheries as a source of food and jobs while protecting ocean ecosystems in the face of changing climate. And how do we do this? We cannot be on the ground everywhere at all times, neither do we want to be, because communities know their fisheries and the impacts of climate change on their fisheries and their communities best. So we do this through facilitating an international network, and that international network has different aims. We have working groups that develop information and tools that can be shared with other fisheries. We do this directly through local and regional collaborations, as well as feedbacks that connect information at the global scale to those local and regional collaborations for information sharing in order to advance these goals. And so here's just a few of the things that we've done. We've hosted workshops here at GMRI to bring people together from all over the world to talk about how climate change is impacting them and how they might continue to work together in the future to share information and to problem solve together. We have projects from a lot of different countries that are highlighted here in orange. And actually, Australia also just added a project from there. And we bring these projects together. They might be working on very different things. Some might be working on understanding how the ocean is changing with climate change. Others might be working on working with small community fishermen on new gear to collect fish. Others might be working on how do you take the information about how climate change is impacting fisheries and make that change how we do fisheries management. And so this is a multi-dimensional and co-developed approach, and with the aim of bringing all that information together to inform climate resilience planning. So here's just an example of some of the things that we bring together. So during one of those workshops that we hosted, we collected information from everyone about what are some of the things that support changes in how you look at fisheries and how fisheries are managed because of climate change, and what are things that are challenges. And overall, we found a lot of the things that are both supports or enabling factors like collaborations and relationships, and having technical capacity or management support can also be challenges. So this really brings up how this is a complicated issue, how having more information is not a golden key all the time, and how a lot of this takes work and looking at from a lot of different perspectives. So bringing it all together, what do I do? I really focus on different components of the marine system and of fishery system. So science through looking at species and habitat, through engagement with bringing people together, understanding what issues are happening both in the Gulf of Maine as well as across the world. And also, um, so does it still look okay? Tried to move and also developing solutions, both technical solutions to this, as well as solutions that can help inform management. So that's what I have, and looking forward to any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got to hear all of the research that you do and all the work that you do. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. And in the meantime, I have a few. I'm curious, what is your favorite part of your job doing this?
Oh, that's hard. I say that's hard, but actually it's really easy. I love learning from other people. It is, it's so cool to like learn about sediment cores, right? Or like I'm not a chemist, and there's a lot of chemistry that goes into understanding how like salt marshes are sequestering carbon. And so it's super fun to learn about that kind of stuff from people, or like for fish core to like learn about what species are doing in like East Africa. Like I never would have thought that I would have, been able to talk with someone at length about that. So I love learning from other people.
Cool. Kind of on that note, do you have an example of a time when maybe folks disagreed about some issue that they were experiencing or the solution to an issue? And like, how do you work through that?
Yeah, definitely. So when I worked for the state as a fisheries manager for river herring, we were river herring, which are alewife and blueback herring are the species that together make up river herring. And there had recently been a what's called a petition, so kind of an argument made to the federal government for them to be listed as an endangered species. And that brings up all sorts of stuff, especially when we're a state that still fishes these fish, and where fishing, alewife and blueback herring are really important to some communities. And so, that also brought up a lot of disagreements, both among government and communities, and also amongst people in the communities, people feeling like we just need to restore these species and not fish for them. And also a lot of arguments about why the continued allowance of sustainable fishing was really important. And so where that kind of came to was, I think, a really big acknowledgement of how sustainable fishing for river herring in Maine is also a really big part of how we continue supporting the runs. So if there's not fishing for them, then there's usually not as many people that are interested in helping them. And so there's not as many people interested in making sure that road crossings allow their passage, or that a beaver dam is not blocking their way to their spawning habitat. And a lot of communities really came together. And also, as a state government management person, really developed some long-lasting friendships with folks through a common understanding of how all of those parts were part of sustainably managing the fish and making sure that they survive. And they ended up not being listed.
Great. We have a question in the chat. What are some of the most promising solutions, or sorry, what are some of the most promising climate solution ideas being discussed, and how can citizens or civilians help?
Yeah, so really depends on it. For whoever asked the question, would love to hear more about like what specific thing you're interested in because so for fisheries, at least in Maine, there's a lot of people who are making sure that they have like they're not just fishing for one single species. So you see people having a solution and maybe getting like multiple different kinds of fishing license or some also adding aquaculture to what they do. So we call that diversified livelihood. And so that's a big solution for fisheries. Also for fisheries, things like allowing how we manage fisheries to be much more flexible instead of having a single rule, being able to change that based on what the fishery is doing and how the species are behaving with climate change. So we call that adaptive management. For things like habitat, that's really where citizens can help. So data collection is super important. So if you live in an area that has a local land trust, certainly reaching out to them and seeing if there are data collection opportunities. There's so much to be said for how that can collect so much more information about what's happening on the ground than, just a couple people trying to go around the whole coastline. So that's a really big way that you can help. Also, there are things like, practices that you have. So if you live close to the coast, making sure that like your septic system works correctly is like a big thing. Or making sure that your town's planning and development includes looking at its coastal resources like salt marsh and eelgrass, and making sure that that's a part of the picture of how your town is planning its development. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm super happy to answer in more detail if there's something specific.
On the note of collecting data, we also offer, as an education department here at GMRI, we offer a lot of curriculum around data collection with the emerald ash borer or coastal flooding signs. So that'll be in my list of links that I send out after this video. Um, and then I had more questions. Um, when you talked about the salt marshes, and how much carbon they store. I'm not sure if you have an answer, but can you explain like how it's possible that salt marshes with a higher tide store more carbon? Like, do we know the
Yes.
reason?
Yeah. It's because they have to, so like this also has to do with like sea level rise. So the way that marshes are formed over thousands and thousands of years is that since the glaciers were melting, after they melted, there was like this really, really fast increase in sea level. And then it started just being kind of this slow upward line. So as sea level was rising a little bit every year, there was a little bit more sediment from the ocean and from like mud flats and stuff like that that came on to the coastal areas. And then marsh grasses started growing on it. And so in order to keep pace with a little bit higher sea level every year, those marshes started adding a little bit more sediment and growing a little bit higher every year. Um, Now with sea level rise, it might be faster than how fast they can grow is a problem. But with tides, the higher that the tide is, it's bringing more sediment onto the marsh every year, and also just the way that that marsh has evolved to behave with how the grasses on top of the salt marsh are. They might grow at a faster rate. And so they're building up higher to keep pace with like the tide being higher over time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's so
Yeah,
fascinating. I love marshes.
yeah,
They're great.
yeah. They're so cool.
And then I'll end it with one last question. What are you most excited about in your field right now?
I really feel like, you know, there's a lot of technological advances, like with both like the equipment that we have for example, for mapping or for monitoring how carbon is exchanged between like the salt marsh surface and the air, or like the multi-beam eco sounder data for mapping the seafloor. So there's like both like some really amazing equipment that is making it so that we can understand our environment a lot better. And I think there's also, this there's a lot of people really interested in it. And so there's a lot of people who can use that kind of information and to start informing our management better. And so I feel like, there's a lot of potential right now, both with technological advances and how we are stepping back and looking at how we can incorporate adaptive management for both habitats and fisheries. And I think that's exciting. And I think we'll make some big advances in the next few years.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. This was really fascinating. Thank you to those who joined, and I hope to see you all next month. Yeah, thanks, Claire.
Thank you.